The stage lights blazed down on the packed auditorium as Arnold Schwarzenegger, the 76-year-old former governor and Hollywood legend, stood confidently at the podium. His massive frame filled the space, his Austrian accent cutting through the air like a sword. The crowd of over 2,000 people had packed every seat, with hundreds more watching from overflow rooms. But what happened in the next 30 seconds would leave the Terminator himself completely speechless. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the rising star from Texas, her sharp suit perfectly pressed, her eyes locked on Arnold with laser focus. At 42, she looked calm and composed. But there was something in her posture, the way she held her shoulders, the slight tilt of her head, that suggested she was ready for war. The audience had no idea they were about to witness political theater at its most explosive. The event had been billed as a conversation on American success, bringing together voices from different generations and backgrounds. Political insiders had been buzzing about it for weeks. Arnold's team was confident this would be another platform for him to showcase his legendary charisma and immigrant success story. They had no idea what was coming. "You think you can lecture us about America?" Arnold had just thundered, his voice echoing off the auditorium walls, pointing directly at Jasmine with the same commanding presence that had dominated movie screens for decades. "I built my success from nothing, and now I see what's wrong with this country." The moderator shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't how these events usually went. The carefully planned discussion about American opportunity was already veering into confrontational territory, and they were only 15 minutes in. But Jasmine's response, delivered with the precision of a surgical strike and the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire career, would not only silence the action hero, but send shockwaves through social media within minutes. This wasn't just a debate. This was about to become the moment that changed everything. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these explosive political moments. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The tension in the room was electric. Phones were already being pulled out discreetly, sensing that something historic was about to unfold. Arnold thought he was facing just another politician who would wilt under his star power and commanding presence. He had no idea he was about to meet his match in the most unexpected way possible. Arnold Schwarzenegger stood on that stage carrying decades of American success on his shoulders. From bodybuilding champion to Hollywood's biggest action star, from the Terminator franchise to governing California for 8 years, this was a man who had conquered every arena he'd entered. At 76, his thick Austrian accent still commanded respect. His presence still dominated any room he walked into. But tonight was different. Tonight, Arnold wasn't just the beloved Terminator or the successful former governor. Tonight he was a man with strong opinions about the direction of America, and he wasn't holding back. His recent comments about younger politicians had stirred controversy, with many saying he was out of touch with modern America. Social media had been buzzing with clips of his previous speeches, where he'd suggested that today's politicians were soft and didn't understand real work. Arnold believed his immigrant success story gave him the right to speak truth to power. After all, he'd come to America with nothing but dreams and built an empire worth hundreds of millions. In his mind, he'd earned the right to critique anyone, especially politicians he saw as all talk and no substance. His confidence was unshakable, built on decades of conquering every challenge thrown his way. The bodybuilding world had told him he was too tall, too foreign, too different. He proved them wrong. Hollywood had said his accent was too thick, his name too difficult. He became the biggest action star in the world. Politics had seemed impossible for an Austrian immigrant. He governed the most populous state in America. In Arnold's mind, there was no obstacle that couldn't be overcome with enough determination and hard work. Tonight he planned to share that message with America once again, especially targeting what he saw as a generation of politicians who made excuses instead of results. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and she was everything Arnold didn't expect. At 42, she represented a new generation of political leadership, sharp, fearless, and completely unimpressed by celebrity status. The Texas Democrat had already made waves in Congress with her quick wit and devastating takedowns of opponents who underestimated her. Her reputation preceded her. Legal colleagues spoke of her ability to dismantle opposing arguments with surgical precision, while political allies marveled at her fearlessness in taking on powerful figures. Jasmine wasn't just another politician. She was a civil rights attorney who'd fought real battles in courtrooms before bringing that same energy to the halls of Congress. Her background was starkly different from Arnold's Hollywood glamour. She'd grown up understanding struggle from day one, watching her family navigate systems that weren't designed for their success. While Arnold was making movies, she was defending people's rights. While he was governing California, she was building a reputation as someone who never backed down from a fight, regardless of how powerful or famous her opponent might be. Her preparation for this moment had been meticulous. She'd studied Arnold's career, his speeches, his political record. She understood his worldview, his strengths, and most importantly, his blind spots. Where Arnold saw his story as universal truth, Jasmine saw the missing pieces, the advantages he'd enjoyed that he didn't even recognize, the barriers he'd never faced that others encountered daily. But what made this confrontation so explosive was the generational and philosophical divide it represented. Here was the immigrant success story facing off against the civil rights fighter, the Hollywood legend versus the courtroom warrior, the established icon versus the rising force. Two completely different versions of the American experience were about to collide on live television. This wasn't just about two people disagreeing. This was about fundamental questions facing America. Who gets to define success? Who has the right to critique? And what happens when old-school thinking meets new-school reality? The broader context made this confrontation even more significant. It was happening at a time when America was grappling with questions about equality, opportunity, and whether the traditional pathways to success were truly available to everyone. The audience represented this divide perfectly. In one section sat older, predominantly white Americans who saw Arnold as a symbol of what was possible in America, proof that anyone could make it with enough drive. In another section were younger, more diverse Americans who admired Jasmine's fight for justice and equality. Between them were the undecideds, people who respected both figures but weren't sure whose vision of America they believed in more. The stakes extended far beyond this single event. Political strategists from both parties were watching closely, understanding that this confrontation could influence how Americans talked about success, merit, and opportunity for years to come. Social media algorithms were already primed to amplify whatever happened, meaning this conversation would reach millions of people within hours. The audience knew they were witnessing something special. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation, with hashtags starting to trend before the real confrontation had even begun. Political insiders were watching closely, understanding that moments like these could shift entire narratives and launch or destroy political careers. Arnold had walked onto that stage confident in his legacy and his right to speak his mind. Jasmine had prepared for this moment her entire career. Every courtroom victory, every legislative battle had led to this. Neither was backing down. Neither was planning to lose. The stage was set for a clash that would be talked about for years to come. The moderator had barely finished introducing the topic when Arnold leaned into his microphone, his famous voice filling every corner of the auditorium. His thick hands gripped the edges of the podium as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be a knockout punch. "Let me tell you something," he began, his Austrian accent thick with conviction and decades of practiced delivery. "I came to America with $7 in my pocket, $7, and I built an empire." The audience stirred, some nodding in approval, others shifting in their seats with anticipation. Arnold was in his element, telling the story he'd told 1,000 times before. In interviews, at political rallies, in motivational speeches around the world. But tonight, there was an edge to it, a challenge directed squarely at the woman sitting across from him. His eyes never left Jasmine as he spoke, clearly expecting to see some sign of intimidation or deference. He found neither. Arnold's confidence was radiating from every pore. This was his moment, his stage, his story to tell. He'd used this narrative to win over Hollywood executives, California voters, and countless audiences worldwide. In his mind, it was irrefutable proof of American opportunity and personal determination. "I didn't complain about the system," Arnold continued, his voice rising. "I didn't blame others for my problems. I worked harder than anyone else. I lifted weights when others slept. I studied English when others partied. I chased the American dream and I caught it." Applause rippled through parts of the crowd, but Jasmine sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Arnold wasn't finished. His confidence was building with each word. And now I look at Congress, and what do I see? People who've never built anything, never created jobs, never risked their own money, telling the rest of us how to live our lives. Arnold's gaze locked onto Jasmine, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. You could feel the tension building like electricity before a storm. The moderator instinctively leaned back in his chair, sensing that his carefully planned discussion was about to go completely off script. Camera operators adjusted their angles, zooming in to capture every micro-expression. The professional lighting cast dramatic shadows across both faces, making this feel less like a political discussion and more like a championship boxing match. "Congresswoman Crockett," Arnold said, his voice dropping to that familiar Terminator-like intensity that had made him millions of dollars and won him political office. "With all due respect, what have you actually built? What businesses have you created? How many people have you employed?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, loaded with decades of American mythology about entrepreneurship and job creation. Some audience members leaned forward in their seats, others shifted uncomfortably. This was exactly the kind of confrontation everyone had come to see, but now that it was happening, the tension was almost unbearable. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, as everyone waited to see how Jasmine would handle this direct assault on her credentials. Arnold's body language exuded complete confidence. He'd clearly expected this question to end the debate before it really began. After all, what politician could match his record of business success and job creation? His slight smile suggested he believed he'd just delivered a decisive blow. Jasmine's response was immediate and calm. "Governor Schwarzenegger, I've built something you can't buy with all your Hollywood money. Trust with the people I represent." But Arnold wasn't backing down. If anything, her response seemed to fuel his fire. "Trust?" Arnold laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. Trust doesn't create jobs. Trust doesn't build hospitals. Trust doesn't fund schools. Results do that, and I've got the results to prove it. He stood up from his chair, his massive frame casting a shadow across the stage. The action movie star was coming out, the man who'd never lost a fight on screen and rarely lost one in real life. "I was governor of the fifth largest economy in the world," Arnold declared, his voice booming. "I made tough decisions. I balanced budgets. I didn't just tweet about problems. I solved them." The audience was split now. Some were cheering Arnold's display of force. Others were watching Jasmine carefully, waiting to see how she would respond to this verbal assault. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand up to match Arnold's imposing presence. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her voice cutting through Arnold's bluster with surgical precision. "Governor, you're absolutely right about one thing," she said, her tone so calm it was almost unsettling. "Results matter, so let's talk about results." Arnold's confident smile faltered just slightly. Something in her tone, something in the way she said those words, made him pause. "You governed California during some of its most challenging times," Jasmine continued, her voice still eerily calm. "You made tough decisions, as you said. But I wonder, do you ever think about the people those tough decisions affected?" Arnold's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned about his record, especially not by someone he clearly viewed as his junior in both age and experience. "I made the decisions that needed to be made," Arnold shot back, his accent becoming thicker as his frustration grew. "Sometimes leadership means making unpopular choices. That's what real leaders do." "Real leaders," Jasmine repeated softly, as if she was tasting the words. "Tell me, Governor, when you were making those real leadership decisions, did you ever have to choose between paying for your child's medication or paying rent?" The question hit the room like a thunderbolt. You could feel the shift in energy, the way the audience suddenly became more focused, more attentive. Arnold's face reddened slightly. "That's not the point." "Did you ever have to work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table?" Jasmine continued, her voice still calm but now carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Did you ever have to explain to your children why they couldn't have new shoes for school?" Arnold was getting visibly agitated now. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. He'd expected to overwhelm her with his credentials, his success story, his larger-than-life presence. Instead, she was systematically dismantling his position with questions that seemed to come from a completely different universe than the one he lived in. Look, Arnold said, his voice rising again. I understand that people struggle. But the answer isn't more government handouts. The answer is what I did: work harder, dream bigger, never give up. The crowd was completely silent now. Everyone could feel that something big was coming. Jasmine sat there for a moment, letting Arnold's words hang in the air, letting the full weight of what he'd just said settle over the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but in the silence of the auditorium, every word carried like thunder. Governor Schwarzenegger, she said, and there was something different in her tone now, something that made even Arnold lean in slightly to hear what came next. I have a question for you. The auditorium fell into complete silence. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the rustle of papers, even the sound of people breathing. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the man who had faced down movie monsters and political opponents alike, stood waiting for whatever Jasmine Crockett was about to say. Jasmine rose slowly from her chair. Not dramatically, not to match Arnold's earlier display of physical presence, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was about to do. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was crystal clear and carried to every corner of the packed room. Governor, you keep talking about working harder, dreaming bigger, never giving up, and I respect that journey. I truly do. Coming to America with $7 and building what you built is remarkable. Arnold's expression softened slightly. For a moment, it seemed like maybe this was going to be a moment of mutual respect, of finding common ground. Jasmine continued, her tone still respectful, but with an edge that suggested she wasn't finished. But I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. She paused, letting the tension build naturally. Arnold shifted on his feet, suddenly looking less confident than he had moments before. When you came to America with those $7, did you have to worry about being shot by police during a traffic stop because of the color of your skin? The question hit the room like a physical force. You could hear the collective intake of breath from the audience. Arnold's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Jasmine wasn't finished. When you were building your bodybuilding career, did casting directors tell you that you looked too threatening for leading roles? When you walked into banks to get business loans, did they assume you were there to rob the place instead of invest in it? Arnold's face was changing now, the color draining from his cheeks as the full impact of her words began to sink in. When you were governor and your children went to school, did you have to have the talk with them? Not about the birds and the bees, but about how to keep their hands visible during police encounters so they could make it home alive. The audience erupted. Some people were on their feet applauding, others were stunned into silence, others were shaking their heads. But all eyes were on Arnold, who stood frozen at his podium, his mouth still slightly open, clearly struggling to process what he'd just heard. Jasmine raised her hand, and somehow, impossibly, the room began to quiet down. She wasn't done. You see, Governor, you and I both believe in hard work. We both believe in the American dream. But we've been playing by completely different rules, and it's time someone said that out loud. Arnold tried to respond, his voice coming out rougher than usual. I never said that everyone's journey was the same. No, Jasmine interrupted, and her voice carried such authority that Arnold actually stopped mid-sentence. You didn't say it, but you implied it every time you suggested that success is just about working harder. Every time you questioned what people like me have built without acknowledging the barriers we've had to overcome just to get in the room. She stepped closer to her microphone, her voice becoming more passionate but never losing its precision. You want to know what I've built, Governor? I've built a career in a justice system that wasn't designed for people who look like me. I've built trust with communities that have been failed by that system for generations. I've built bridges between worlds that people like you don't even know exist. Arnold was now visibly struggling. The confident movie star, the successful businessman, the former governor, all of that seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a man who was clearly out of his depth. Jasmine looked directly at Arnold, her gaze steady and unwavering. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute truth. Governor Schwarzenegger, you came to America and became the Terminator. But the difference between us is that I came into this world already having to terminate the assumption that I didn't belong here." The room went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that comes before applause, but the kind that comes when everyone realizes they've just witnessed something historic, something that will be talked about and remembered for years to come. Arnold stood at his podium, and for the first time in perhaps his entire public life, the man who had always had an answer, who had always projected absolute confidence, looked completely and utterly speechless. His mouth moved as if he was trying to form words, but nothing came out. His hands, which had been gesturing confidently throughout the evening, hung limply at his sides. The man who had portrayed the unstoppable Terminator looked like his circuits had just been completely fried. The audience's reaction was unlike anything anyone had ever seen at a political event. Some people were crying. Others were standing and applauding so loudly it sounded like thunder. Still others sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. A woman in the front row was overheard saying to her companion, "I've never heard anyone explain it like that before." A middle-aged man was shaking his head, saying, "I never thought about it that way." But the most telling reaction came from Arnold himself. As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, as he realized that his entire worldview had just been challenged in a way he'd never experienced before, his expression changed from confusion to something that looked almost like recognition. When Arnold finally managed to speak, his voice was barely above a whisper. I never meant to imply." He stopped, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look years older than when the evening had started. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said finally, his famous accent now sounding strained and uncertain. I think I need to think about what you just said." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of defeat. But coming from Arnold Schwarzenegger, the man who had built his entire career on never backing down, never showing weakness, it was perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said in public. What had just happened went far beyond a simple political debate. This was a moment when two completely different American experiences had collided, when privilege had been forced to confront perspective, when success had been redefined in real time. Jasmine had done something that millions of people had been trying to do for years. She had found a way to explain the concept of systemic barriers and different starting points in a way that even someone as successful and confident as Arnold Schwarzenegger couldn't dismiss or ignore. The moderator, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. I think we all need a moment to process what just happened here. But the damage, or perhaps the enlightenment, was already done. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator himself, had been terminated. Not by weapons or violence, but by truth delivered with surgical precision by a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to fight battles he never even knew existed. Within minutes of the confrontation ending, the clip was everywhere. The exchange between Arnold and Jasmine didn't just trend on social media, it exploded across every platform simultaneously. Terminator, terminated, Hadar Jasmine knockout, and Dr. Different Rules were all trending within the first hour, with millions of posts flooding in from around the globe. The video of Arnold's face when Jasmine delivered her final line, that moment of complete shock and realization, became an instant meme. But unlike most political memes that are designed to mock or demean, this one seemed to capture something deeper, the exact moment when privilege encounters perspective and doesn't know how to respond. GIF creators worked overtime, capturing the precise second when Arnold's confident expression crumbled into bewildered silence. A video compilation of Arnold's confident opening statements followed by his speechless reaction garnered over 2 million views in the first 3 hours. Comment sections across platforms were filled with people sharing their own stories about facing barriers that successful people often couldn't see or understand. The conversation had sparked something much larger than just political debate. It had opened a national dialogue about hidden advantages and unseen obstacles. International news outlets picked up the story within hours. European media focused on Arnold's Austrian background and how American success stories were being redefined. Asian networks highlighted the generational and cultural clash. African media emphasized Jasmine's points about systemic barriers. The confrontation had become a global conversation about opportunity, privilege, and the complexity of the American dream. Major news networks scrambled to cover the story, but they struggled with how to frame it. This wasn't your typical political takedown where someone was caught in a lie or exposed for corruption. This was something much more complex and nuanced. Progressive outlets hailed Jasmine as a hero who had finally found a way to explain systemic inequality in terms that couldn't be dismissed. Conservative commentators found themselves in an awkward position. They couldn't attack Arnold without undermining their own narrative, but they also couldn't easily defend his position after what had just happened. One prominent political analyst was quoted saying, "I've been covering politics for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. It wasn't about gotcha moments or talking points. It was about fundamental differences in lived experience, and somehow Congresswoman Crockett found a way to make that real for everyone watching." Behind the scenes, Arnold's advisors and public relations team were in crisis mode. How do you spin a moment where your client was left completely speechless? How do you recover from what appeared to be a fundamental challenge to your entire worldview? Initial attempts to downplay the exchange fell flat. A statement released by Arnold's team saying he looked forward to continuing the conversation was widely mocked online. People weren't interested in political spin. They had witnessed something authentic, and they could tell the difference. Arnold himself remained notably quiet in the immediate aftermath. For a man who had built his career on bold statements and confident proclamations, his silence spoke volumes. For Jasmine Crockett, the moment represented a career-defining triumph, but she handled it with characteristic grace. In interviews following the confrontation, she didn't gloat or attack Arnold personally. Instead, she used the attention to further explain the points she had made. "This was never about Governor Schwarzenegger as a person," she said in a television interview the next day. "This was about helping people understand that the American dream exists, but the path to it isn't the same for everyone. When we acknowledge that, we can work together to make it more accessible." Her favorability ratings among Democratic voters skyrocketed, but more importantly, she began receiving support from unexpected quarters. Moderate Republicans and independents who had never heard of her before were suddenly paying attention to her message. The confrontation sent shockwaves through political circles in both parties. Democratic leaders saw in Jasmine a new voice who could articulate complex issues of equality and justice in ways that resonated with broader audiences. Her ability to challenge someone as prominent as Arnold without resorting to personal attacks or typical political rhetoric was seen as exactly the kind of communication style the party needed. Republican strategists, meanwhile, were forced to grapple with uncomfortable questions about their own messaging around success and merit. The traditional bootstrap narrative that Arnold had been pushing suddenly seemed incomplete at best, tone-deaf at worst. "She didn't just beat him in a debate," one Republican consultant admitted privately. "She made his entire argument look like it was missing half the equation." But perhaps the most significant impact wasn't in political circles at all. It was in living rooms, offices, and dinner tables across America. The confrontation sparked millions of conversations about privilege, barriers, and different starting points in ways that abstract policy discussions never could. Parents used the moment to explain to their children why some people have advantages, others don't. Teachers incorporated the exchange into discussions about American history and civil rights. Even corporate diversity training programs began using clips from the confrontation to illustrate concepts that had previously been difficult to communicate. One viral social media post captured the broader sentiment. "I've been trying to explain privilege to my dad for years. 5 minutes of Jasmine Crockett did what I couldn't do in 5 years." Perhaps the most surprising development came weeks later when Arnold broke his silence in a thoughtful, lengthy social media post that shocked both his supporters and critics. "I've been thinking a lot about what Congresswoman Crockett said," he wrote. "I came to America and worked hard, and I'm proud of what I built. But she's right. I never had to worry about things that other people worry about every day. That doesn't make my success less real, but it does mean I need to think differently about other people's struggles." The post went on to announce that Arnold would be partnering with civil rights organizations to learn more about the barriers that different communities face. It wasn't a full apology, but it was an acknowledgement that the conversation had fundamentally changed his perspective. Months after the confrontation, political scientists and communications experts were still analyzing what had made Jasmine's approach so effective. Unlike typical political attacks that often backfire or create defensive reactions, she had managed to challenge Arnold's worldview while still respecting his achievements. She didn't tell him his success wasn't real, noted one professor of political communication. She helped him understand that his path to success wasn't the only path, and that some people face obstacles he never had to overcome. That's a much more powerful message than simply attacking someone's record. The exchange became required viewing in political science courses, communication programs, and leadership training seminars. It was studied not just for its political impact, but as an example of how to have difficult conversations about complex topics in ways that actually change minds rather than just scoring points. The confrontation between Arnold and Jasmine represented something larger than just one moment between two political figures. It demonstrated that American audiences were hungry for substantive discussions about real issues, delivered with intelligence and authenticity, rather than sound bites and attack lines. Politicians across the political spectrum began trying to emulate Jasmine's approach, using personal stories and lived experiences to illustrate policy positions, speaking with passion but without losing precision, challenging opponents' ideas without attacking their character. The success of this approach suggested that American political discourse might be evolving beyond the typical partisan shouting matches that had dominated for years. Voters seemed to respond positively to politicians who could explain complex issues in human terms, and who could challenge each other's ideas without resorting to personal destruction. The impact of that one evening continued to spread in unexpected ways. Young people who had never paid attention to politics began following Jasmine's career. Established politicians began studying her communication style. Even international observers noted how she had managed to discuss issues of race and inequality in ways that educated rather than divided. Arnold, for his part, became an unlikely advocate for examining privilege and barriers. His journey from confident challenger to speechless listener to thoughtful learner became its own powerful story about the possibility of growth and change, even for people who seemed set in their ways. The confrontation offered several key lessons that extended far beyond politics. First, it showed that effective communication about difficult topics requires understanding your audience and meeting them where they are, rather than simply attacking their position. Second, it demonstrated that personal stories and lived experiences can be more powerful than abstract arguments or statistics when trying to change minds. Third, it proved that it's possible to challenge someone's worldview while still respecting their humanity and achievements. Finally, it suggested that American audiences are ready for more sophisticated political discourse. They can handle complexity, nuance, and difficult truths when they're presented with skill and authenticity. In the end, the confrontation between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jasmine Crockett became more than just a viral moment or a political victory. It became a masterclass in communication, a lesson in empathy, and a demonstration of how real change happens, not through force or volume, but through truth delivered with precision and purpose. Arnold had walked onto that stage as the Terminator, confident in his ability to overwhelm any opponent. He left as a student, humbled by an encounter with perspectives he had never considered. Jasmine had arrived as a rising political star. She departed as a voice for a new generation of leadership that could bridge divides while still fighting for justice. The moment when Arnold stood frozen in shock became symbolic of a larger awakening. The recognition that the American story is far more complex than any one person's experience can capture, and that true leadership requires the humility to listen, learn, and grow. What did you think of this incredible showdown? Did Jasmine change your perspective on these issues the way she changed Arnold's? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more explosive political moments that you won't see anywhere else. The next confrontation could be even more shocking than this one, and trust me, you won't want to miss it when it happens.